Every year around this time, people do something crazy. They scare themselves. There's nothing wrong with watching a scary movie any time of the year. But perhaps it's when the darkness envelops us more in the fall, or when the veil between the living world and the dead is at its thinnest, that watching The Fearful Fair is more fun. I'm your host, Victor. This is PopCon, a salute to all pop culture, but mostly the 80s. Today's pop conversation, the slasher. No matter what it takes you to get into the spirit of the season, we must give credit where credit is due. So join me, won't you, as we explore the history and the evolution of the horror film.
In the 30s through the mid-40s, distinct horror movies were made with all the love and passion of today's epics and blockbusters. The original masterpieces of Dracula, Frankenstein and his bride, The Wolfman, Mummy, and more would bask in the light of their intense success. James Whale would prove a prolific director of a number of these, even if he did not believe he was making art. But that success would lead to its own tarnished reputation. As their stars rose, the successive horror films began to suffer with what would become a theme of low-budget sequels and B-grade horror knockoffs, an equation that would repeat itself over the decades. The money-making horror genre brought to cinemas on the coattails of their grand ancestors did not always mean greater art form, and the subpar quality that followed the genuine articles would become synonymous with horror, poking fun at themselves and making merry of once important characters and themes just to earn a buck when the luster of the original had no longer been deemed worthy. This was the Dark Ages, from the latter half of the 40s with monster mashups and comedic romps, all the way through the end of the 1950s. The Dark Ages brought stale stories one after another, with one-dimensional characters and unknown actors in gothic treatments where direction was shoddy and slow-paced. Or we were handed repeat offenders in the form of studios one-upping each other for the newest and wildest creature to stalk their prey, mainly teenagers. It was to them the Dark Ages of horror was targeted in the 50s. The teenage population were growing since folks came back from the war in the 1940s. They had free time and some disposable income. The baby boomers were in high school, and they were in love.
Promise to satisfy your hunger, your thirst, your sweet tooth. So visit our refreshment center now.
The horror film was relegated to date movies, where young stray hands could find themselves copping a feel, while the main feature creature in a monkey suit wearing a space helmet did nothing to advance the storytelling of fear. There were some bright spots, however, at the time, whether it was Creature from the Black Lagoon in 1954 or Forbidden Planet in 1956 starring a young and dashing Leslie Nielsen. Assuredly raising the bar on sci-fi with a touch of mysterious horror, Forbidden Planet was rare amongst the pantheon of cheap and tawdry offerings, but more importantly, paved the way for a far more exciting and iconic haunted house in space movie, Alien. 3D couldn't even help the Dark Ages. This era was filled with gimmicks to get you to the theater. I'm talking to you, Vincent Price, and your Tingler. There just wasn't any more pushing the envelope, but at least the envelope was still available. It was the late 1950s and the end of the studio system of Hollywood. Thanks a lot, Cleopatra. This meant freedom, and freedom exploded with directors, actors, and writers. We weren't quite embracing the 60s free love just yet, but it was pushing upward like a bud of an aromatic flower ready to open, only to be violently cut down by a weed whacker, or in this case, a chainsaw. We were entering a silver age. Horror movies were being helmed by more free-thinking, innovative, creative writers and directors. New concepts and storytelling was taking horror out of the trash and the back alleys while injecting some life into it. Studios had to take chances, and they were willing, highlighted with a bang with the likes of Psycho. This masterpiece showed Alfred Hitchcock still had it, and he could surprise and delight. Horror movies would rise from the dead and walk again.
They're coming to get you, Barbara.
Stop it!
This now iconic phrase brings to mind a vision of horror that may first strike you as camp, but by the end you realize you have been hooked and held on to the wild ride of the first true zombie survivor film. Even with questionable acting and editing, the movie would continue to pave the way to breathe life into the genre, raise the dead, as it were. It succeeded and began a new wave where young filmmakers defied the status quo, crossed the line of the established expectation of cinema visuals, while allowing us to question our limits of our darker side. The work done in the Silver Age continued. It was only a stopgap for what was to come. But even with those few stellar entries into the list, new and upcoming filmmakers took notice and began to think big. They would turn the whole genre on its ear, even if they had to sever that ear. Original stories and content were the goal. No more simple monsters from space taking the pretty beach blonde until the tall, dark, and handsome surfers saved the day. Unique stories were in order, and they began to appear in a steady pace in cadence with the changing times and social norms of the country. The grungy 70s were hitting hard, with characters on the fringe of society, characters who experienced vice and had a naughty side, more lifelike than previously on display. This open and liberal look at the way of life for the new young people was exciting and different. It attracted moviegoers, but was often the very thing that meant death to the characters in the film. That is, of course, until the final girl. Don't fret for those forgotten creature features of the past. One man's trash is another's treasure, and the trail of countless tacky monster movies was not all lost. Those poor saps of the B-grade flicks found new life. Those entries from the late 1940s to the end of the 50s would have their new day in the sun when resurrected on TV by popular horror hosts to seemingly pop up everywhere on local access channels. Like this little enchantress. Witty banter and sexual innuendo made the horrible plots and lackluster acting palatable during the late night viewing. The water had been tested in the Silver Age. Seeing what audiences would go for and what they could get away with, writers and directors began to bring validity to the genre. Even if the Academy of Arts and Sciences would not legitimize films of this nature, even critics would applaud the first entry of these new, exciting, and extremely original stories that captivated us and truly frightened us with atmospheric fear and authentic jump scares. From Black Christmas to the wild ride of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, from A Prom Gone Wrong for our telekinetic Carrie to the Antichrist birth and The Omen, The Exorcist's audacious topic and the execution to the rarely successful, nevertheless intense sci-fi horror legend, Alien, we were off to a great start. None of these followed a formula, and the decade would wind up with the classic tale of a masked babysitter murderer whose trail of terror was simply evil. The 80s premiered, and we were already sitting back and settling into the renaissance of horror. It may be considered the Bronze Age, but this is no last place where movies with never before heard of storylines stole our imaginations and created very real nightmares both while awake and asleep. Creepshow and American Werewolf in London, with its intelligent writing and use of casual and unexpected classic music, had fun with gore and scares that at first had us confused on how to react, but we knew in the end they were still horrific. There were thrillers as well. Poltergeist made us uneasy and excited with fear, and a winner at the box office, even with a PG rating. But it was the R-rated billings at the Cineplex that caused gasps and true surprise and outright screams, and we did it together in a shared experience that seems a distant memory today. John Carpenter's The Thing showed us something we fear the most without ever really seeing it, and The Evil Dead took us on a joyride of dread that never seemed to come up for air. It was this era that for the first time we were understanding horror from the killer's point of view. That was the story's first focus, up until they flipped the switch mid-movie and the killer is upstaged by that infallible final girl. Friday the 13th and his tale of a mother's revenge for her son's death at summer camp, or Wes Craven's living nightmare in the form of a serial child molester continuing to stalk and pay back the young of those that burned him alive on Elm Street. The Bronze Age was a highlight, and this is where pop culture took notice. And although the Universal classic monsters had never been completely out of sight, they never had the same kind of marketing or publicity push or the resurgence of popularity that they would have, all due to these new entries and their power within pop culture.
The truth is that when you take a walk down our opposition's memory lane, it starts to look like Nightmare on Elm Street.
Dial this number now and I'll tell you Freddy's favorite bedtime story.
Talking about living in pop culture, what about that final girl? This is a term and a theme that has been coined for some time and lives on in our pop culture lexicon today. To tell you more about it, I have located a true expert.
Oh, there's nothing worse for a serial killer than a final girl. You know, the virginal, do-gooder, smarty pants whose resourcefulness usually defeats us and she lives to tell the tale. But luckily, I haven't had that problem.
There has been so much discussion, research, study of the subject, it certainly deserves its own complete entry into PopCon. Nevertheless, it is during the Bronze Age Renaissance that we see the downplaying of a male slayer to overpower our antagonist, and the rise of a pure and usually intelligent woman who will win the day and, although be usually the sole survivor, vanquish the killer in the end. It is not always so cut and dry, but there is a formula, and it's not only worked often, it works well, most of the time. We can't deny these famous survivors fit the overall bill. With minor discrepancies between them, they are all strong female leads that no matter their later fate in the series, they are all heroines. And if anyone wants to argue the fact that Ripley from Alien is not a final girl because sci-fi somehow doesn't fit the horror movie structure, you're out of your mind and I will fight you. Amazingly, the trend continues today in some form or another. However, in modern fare, it is often that trait of survival as a mandate for the final girl that gets sacrificed. So then, are they the final girl? You be the judge.
While you consider that, consider this. Subscribe to my channel. PopCon is relatively new and I'm looking for my 10th subscriber. For the lucky number 10, you'll receive this Final Girls t-shirt. This t-shirt, designed by yours truly, is perfect for the holiday season, or any time of the year, to show you and everyone that no matter the adversity, like Lori, Alice, or Nancy, you too can be a final girl. Subscribe now for your chance to win.
It was 1985 and we started to see the endless parade of sequels, but it was this movie that marked the end, or possibly the beginning. Fright Night took a tongue-in-cheek approach to horrific subjects with real scares, but a little more fun on the side. Still original, it opened the door for two things: the step back from the serious subjects and original content, and the soon-to-debut Enlightened era. Until then, we would be saddled with the low-budget sequels of questionable quality and the return of the quick cash grab with over-campy and cheap creature features that all but repeated the destruction of the genre that had happened in the 50s. There were still the unusual and noteworthy exceptions. Hellraiser, coming in 1987, was one of the last true original horrors that are thought to make the mainstream before the rise of the Enlightenment.
Hello?
What's your favorite scary movie?
Wow, thank you for asking. I never even thought to tell my viewers my favorite movie. Well, Poltergeist is one of my favorites, but American Werewolf in London really has some great effects. And, well, The First Nightmare on Elm Street. Wait a minute, is this some kind of survey? What's going on?
You never told me your name.
Well, you didn't tell me your name either. Wait a minute, why do you want to know my name?
I want to know who I'm looking at.
Okay, with that, I think we'll have to take a rain check. A dark and stormy night check on furthering into the Enlightenment. But I will leave you with this. Scream would kick it off in style. Sure, there was parody, but there was no laughing at the subject of visceral imagery of high-class direction. Tongue-in-cheek, all while hands covering eyes. The Enlightenment was to begin, but it was a careful and slow burn that has led to a long and steady tradition of everything from the found footage to paranormal documentaries, to no survivors, while sometimes dishing up zero scares, replacing it with intense atmospheric dread. Luckily, there is no slowdown. Now the genre has found its place and works steadily, always taken seriously, even when the film perhaps does not fully deliver. Well, that's enough for now. We'll have to get more to that later. Right now, I've got to go lock my doors.
Well, congratulations on making it to the end. I hope this isn't the last of my Halloween-themed pop conversations. But as for now, I'll bid you adieu. I hope you share and comment this video and come back for more. And always remember LSN. Like, subscribe, notify. And to quote an icon, unpleasant dreams.